Okay, I'm going to start. So we're going to tackle the gender issues and politics in the Middle East this week, and this is the layout of the lecture. So we're going to start out with how women's oppression or women's representation occupies a central place in Orientalist discourse and the knowledge production in Western academia. And then we will have like a critical overview of the major theoretical approaches that address the issue of woman oppression in the Middle East, the modernization theory, the dependency theory, and the radical feminist approach that actually became essential part of some social theories in the 60s and 70s. And then we can offer like alternative conceptualization of feminism from different theoretical perspectives. The first one, anti-imperialist or decolonial perspective of feminism, and developmental studies that focus on socioeconomic injustice and the possibility and interrogated possibilities of transnational activism in order to improve the socioeconomic status of women in the global South, including the Middle East, and then Islamic modernism or Muslim feminism, how they tackled issues related to woman oppression from a critical perspective or from alternative theoretical angles or conceptual angles. And then we will try, hopefully we can cover like as much as we can, like some literature or some studies that the approach, these kind of women issues from like complex perspective that actually pushed the focus away from woman's body as as a discourse or as a representation of anything but women themselves. So we are going to focus on the state and how the state actually discursively or used like certain discourses and institutions and deploy, this kind of woman body in order to advance some policies or to instill some ideas regarding collective image of the nation or trigger anti-colonial struggle. And so we focus on these discourses that actually used women as a symbol of the nation and used their bodies as well. And the state building processes and institutional setting that actually affected the woman position with regard to when it comes to family laws that affected woman position, the personal status or in relation to family members or the marriage institution. And then we will focus on women agency in peace and war times and what agency means and how they offer like alternative explanations to this agency or to gender role. We will focus on the Kurdish women, that they became active combatant or contributed to the military operation against ISIS, and the role of women in anti-colonial struggle in the Middle East and how they occupied central position in associational spaces. And then the conceptualization, we need to conceptualize diversity in Islam, so we need to push the focus again away from this kind of Islam as a monolithic system that shape women's conditions in same ways across time and spaces. And this is what we're going to tackle in the seminar by focusing on Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Egypt. So if I ask like Orientalism and women representation, what Orientalism means from last semester? Yeah, so basically it's a monopoly over knowledge production. And because like the West, like they have like, the power over the knowledge production and over like Orientalism as an institution when it comes to knowledge production or media framing. So they claim, they have like this monopoly over truth or making claim about the Orient as an object. So they have like, the claim to the truth, and they have like the truthful analysis to provide for the Orient, or including like the Middle East. And they depart from these kind of oppositional objects, and they depart from these kind of like the Orient and the East and the West are ontologically distinct civilization. And of course, like woman position occupies, or woman oppression occupies central position in their depiction of the Orient as exotic and backward culture. So if I ask you about like the image of women oppression that captured the imagination of the Western media or Western academia, what this image is all about, as it appears in the pictures. Yeah. Yeah. So they use like women, and especially like, Muslim women, as a symbol of this kind of exotic and mysterious culture. And this is what Chared mentioned, like gaze lowered, wrapped in a veil, walking 10 steps behind a man, walking in his shadow, and in doing so becoming a shadow herself. This is what one of my students wrote in describing images of Muslim women in popular culture in the United States. So this is exactly how they depict women representation. And of course, they use Islam or the religion as the essence of women oppression and women subjugation as a monolithic system that would shape, these oppressive conditions across time and space. So, and of course, like they use this like in women oppression in order to legitimize discursively or effectively the foreign policy, like active foreign policy in the Middle East. And this is how the United States used women oppression as part and parcel of its foreign policy after September 11 in order to provide, or to channel some funds or to fund resources to civil society organizations in order to help women, to help these civil society organizations to instill some sort of policies or to push for certain policies and discourse that would help women to step out of their oppressive conditions. And like women oppression and like improving women rights and like saving women or liberating women were part and parcel of the Middle East Partnership Initiative in December 2002 and the broader Middle East and North Africa Initiative or policy in June 2004. Cook actually mentioned that they use, like in Western academia or Western media, they use like Muslim woman as one word in order to eliminate any kind of distinction or individuality of women's identity or different forms of self-expression. And this they use it in order to evoke, these kind of singular identity and to eliminate any sort of self-reflection or self-expression or variation in these kind of different visions of the world they might endorse, women might endorse. And some of the Arab scholars, or of course some of these kind of Middle Eastern civil society organizations that they talk, these funds from the United States, they replicate or they reproduce the same discourse by attributing these kind of oppressive women conditions in the Middle East to Islam and culture. And the Islam and culture are the main causes of women disempowerment in the Middle East. So they became like, they reproduced these kind of Orientalist discourse themselves. And this is what happened with the Arab Human Development Report in 2005, as Abu Lughd mentioned. So these are like the main theoretical approaches that interrogate like women oppression in the Middle East, we are going to start with the modernization theory. Any take on the main assumptions or propositions of this theory? You're not with, yeah. Yeah. So they depart from these kind of dichotomous view of societies, like traditional versus modern, secular versus religion, industrial versus agricultural versus industrial. So they depart of these kind of oppositional binaries or opposition views of societies, and for them, like a state would be like the main agent to bring about, these kind of social changes and improve, the position of women in the Middle East. By formulating educational policies and family planning policies that would help women to improve their position, and by marginalizing the role of the Islamic clergy and like allocating more powerful role in decision making or policy making to secular elements or secular elites. Any criticism to this approach? So the whole point, we are going to tackle like three main theoretical approaches from critical standpoint, and what they gloss over, or what they overlook actually. Yeah, these kind of binary oppositional categories, they actually they eliminate, these kind of any possibility of complex understanding of social interactions and social dynamics, and they overlook, the possibility of the reconstruction and redefinition of these categories, what modernization or modernity means across time and spaces, and they actually assign like a prominent role to the state in order to improve, the conditions of women, or to help them to get out of their oppressive conditions. But they neglect, the role of the political alignment or political allegiances that actually the state could make, and this would undermine, the position of women, as we are going to see how like the processes of state building in North Africa pushed Algeria and Morocco to strike, some deals with some tribes or conservative elements in this patrilineal kinship system that affected the family laws, or the promulgation of conservative family laws that affected subsequently the position of women. Dependency theory. So they focus mainly, they depart from, the same Marxist assumptions and economic determinism assumptions that actually focuses on, these assumptions focus on processes of historical or capitalist development in the global South that actually led to dual like class and sexual suppression or oppression. So because of this kind of alliance between domestic entrepreneurs or domestic compradors with foreign capitalists, this reduced the status of women to cheap labor or fundamental consumerist, and this affected, their socioeconomic position. So it's a patriarchal class oppression, and due to this kind of capitalist mode of production. So the mode of production as infrastructural conditions did account for the oppressive status of women, and religion and culture would come next, or secondary variables, as Marxist analysis would assume. And the only way out for women emancipation is to usher in, or to push for the socialist transformation that would improve, the economic position in society. Any criticism to this account as well? they adhere to like this crude version, of Marxist analysis by focusing heavily on economic factors or the mode of production as the exclusive or the only variable would account for the sexual and class oppression. And they offer like, this kind of general overview, and they overlook the specificity of national culture, because like by pushing Islam and cultural processes outside of the analysis, they further essentialized Islam, and they deny the fact that in some context like Islam and culture and cultural norms would play a pivotal and important role in suppressing or oppressing women. So they didn't as well like capture the complexity of the cultural processes and the social interactions that would undermine the position or subjugate women in some societies. And idealization that socialist transformation would improve, the status of women. Feminist approaches. Any guess on the main assumption of radical feminist approaches? Sorry. Yeah, they focus mainly on patriarchy or the male dominance as like the cornerstone or the main the key variable that actually determine social interactions or would account for women oppression in their personal and social interactions. And actually this kind of patriarchy as a terminology was grafted onto like a variety of social theories in order to make it relevant to gender theories or the conceptualization of gender. And of course, they focus on Islam as the main cause of women oppression or subjugation of women in Muslim countries, including the Middle East. And it's actually more like repackaging of the modernization assumptions and Enlightenment assumptions that would help women, that like the endorsement of the key values of the Western culture would offer this linear progression towards like women freedom, denying possibility of different like women denying any other possibilities or any other ways of constructing a world of their own in order to act on or to live in. So they have like this kind of missionary mission. So they have like they have to instill these kind of values, and in order to play the role of the savior, in order to help women to get out of their oppressive conditions. And they have these kind of idealist bias in order to remake the world according to or in accordance with the key values of the Western culture. And they have like this is the only way for salvation and emancipation of women in these countries. Any criticism to this? Yeah, and this is like the critique like offered by this post-colonial and anti-imperialist tendencies to feminist theories. So here they depart from this kind of the criticism of these kind of false assumptions about like superiority of Western culture and inferiority of every other or any other cultures, and this kind of denying of the role of the religions and traditions in order to in empowering women or in helping them to construct their the world of their own making or of their own choice. So this kind of like the focus on the criticize this moral superiority as the key cause or the main cause that would reproduce these kind of imperialist inclinations or imperialist policies of some Western organizations or Western academia. So like this kind of like playing a role of the savior or claiming, this kind of saving mission. It involves a sense of superiority by Westerners and lack of reflection about, the violences entailing this and transformations. And they use like Afghan women in order to highlight, this kind of the failure or like the shortcoming or the deficiencies of this viewpoint, because they intervened for example, the United States intervened in Afghanistan in order to save women. Then they focused heavily on the issue of hijab or the headscarf, and they denied, this kind of empowering women through education and offering some other social services that would help women make free choices. And this actually had harmful consequences for women's position in Afghanistan, and they made them soft target, for extremists or fundamentalists that actually attacked them, and they became target of violence. For Laila Abu Lughd, Afghan women might be called to personhood, so to speak, in a different language, on one in which they wish to retain forms of life with the strong family ties or orient their lives towards religion. So it's all about how they make free choice in order to live their own life, or to construct and reconstruct a world of their own choice. And decolonial or post-colonial or anti-imperialist tendencies in feminist theory, they claim that there is no need to abandon, these kind of universal norms or values altogether. But the only thing to repudiate is this kind of imperialist imposition and this kind of saving assumptions, like saving mission or this kind of saving assumption. But the only universal norm they can adhere to is this kind of universalist opposition to imperialism and sexist oppression. So the only thing they can adhere to is eliminating, any kind of structural causes of injustice or sexist oppression. And this would differ from context to context. So feminism requires universalist opposition to sexist oppression, but feminism doesn't require universal adoption of Western, or more specifically what I call Enlightenment liberal, values and strategies. And this this trend, they included intersectionality later in order to highlight, this kind of systemic discrimination against women due to their membership in a specific gender system. So it's not only about gender role, it has some class element or race element as well. And the only way out by adhering to these kind of universalist norm of rejecting opposition to imperialism or imposition and sexist oppression due to the membership in certain gender system. So they have they offer some epistemic solution by bringing Western culture in as a target of criticism, because by highlighting moral superiority or assuming this kind of saving role, assuming the savior role, this actually put the Western culture outside of any kind of criticism. So they call it out, and the Western culture for them is an object of criticism. This is first of all. And the second of all is how to theorize normatively about women in the global South by acknowledging, different specificities regarding the context, social dynamics, social interactions, different cultural norms, acknowledging their adherence to different cultural norms and values. So starting with the critique of Western culture, they highlight, the main, or the main cause behind, the interventionist policies of the United States or Western countries in the global South or in the Middle East, not necessarily to help women to step out of their oppressive conditions or to help them to recognize their subjugation, but actually we need to plug in the global unjust structures and vulnerabilities in order to in order to acknowledge or to analyze thoroughly the main motives behind these interventionist policies. So they focus mainly on the cost of moralism and filtering out information. As I mentioned, the media actually concealed or obscured these kind of harmful consequences, for Afghan women by highlighting, these kind of, or focusing mainly on the headscarf or the hijab. They actually relegated or marginalized the harmful consequences or the violence committed against women in Afghanistan. So there is like a cost of this kind of moral superiority assumption, and by concealing some information or filtering out some information, this didn't provide a precise picture about what was going on in Afghanistan. So this would help media and scholars to expose contradictions of decontextualization, and you need to bring context back into the analysis. Away from Western culture, some interventionist policies by empowering policies by transferring or channeling, some funds to civil society organizations in order to empower women. For example, how to empower women in informal market or informal sector. This didn't lead to this form of financial autonomy or financial independence. This led to feminization of responsibility. For example, in Egypt and in some slum areas, by providing, women with some equipment or some financial aids, husbands relied heavily on women in order to provide for their families, rather than, so they didn't become financially independent as the initial target of the policies aimed at. This actually overloaded or burdened them with the responsibility to provide for the family. So you need. There is, nothing, here, I'm just my mission or my job is not to offer clear solution. I'm just presenting, different debates or controversial issues in the literature, okay? And it depends on, it depends on the context. I don't deny that the financial independence of women is something wrong, but in some context, this would overburden them, would add some sort of responsibilities or caring tasks that actually burden them rather than empowering them financially. For example, they have a specific image about women empowerment or participation in decision-making processes. And they neglect, the fact that in some contexts, this would make women vulnerable or marginalized more. In rural areas, in Egypt or in other Middle Eastern countries, women participation in village councils, they might be considered by themselves as form of empowerment or participation in decision-making process. But for Western, feminism, or from Western perspective, it's not empowering, or it's not that empowering because it occurred, behind or outside of the realm of the national institutions, that they didn't have actually a say in decision-making processes at the national level. So you need this kind of to highlight the context or the gender role, to put the gender role within some context in order to understand how they understand, their empowerment and how they make their own choices. Normative theorization about others in order to thoroughly theorize about women in the global South or in the Middle East. Scholars, need to avail themselves of these kind of contextual knowledge or specificities in order to thoroughly understand, the social dynamics and social interactions. So, it doesn't mean that it's a binary choice between ethnocentric approach of modernization theory or radical feminism or cultural relativism, but it has because cultural relativism means that scholars or civil society organizations had nothing to do. It's a byproduct. This kind of woman oppression is a byproduct of historical processes or social interactions that they had nothing to do with, and this would eliminate any kind of intervention. So the only thing for like decolonial, post-colonial, anti-imperialist feminists, they would claim that the only thing they can do is justice enhancing interventionist policies by understanding the context in order to empower women to politically or financially or socially in order to make their own choice or to reshape the world or to act upon the world of their own choice or of their own making without reification of cultural differences. So without like departing from this kind of moral superiority or these kind of political concepts about enlightenment or subjugation of women. So they have like, these kind of understanding of different contexts, and accordingly they can formulate policies, or they can put forward or advance some policy recommendations that would improve, the women conditions, depending on these kind of contextual informations and historical conditions that led to these kind of oppressive or like these kind of oppressive conditions or subjugating position. Another alternative theory, in addition to the post-colonial and anti-imperialist approaches, development studies, they highlight mainly like the socioeconomic conditions that undermined, the socioeconomic status or deteriorated the living conditions of women in the global south, in order to examine or to explore possibilities of transnational activism that would enable women to act and to engage actively in order to advance their livelihoods. So they highlight, some economic factors, how they can help women in order to generate income, to get access to labor market, and to participate or to contribute to development projects. So the specific, according to Syed here, the specific approach that has developed in relation to Muslim women began not with Arab differences, nor with Islam, but with socioeconomic forces that shape them. And it's a byproduct of these kind of historical and contemporary social and political processes. So we need to understand these kind of processes in order to intervene or to recommend some policies that would enhance their socioeconomic conditions and to change these modalities of participation in economic life. And some of the studies in this trend, they interweaved, these kind of socioeconomic status with some cultural and religious norms. For example, the Thacker mentioned, this kind of subordinate or position of women in rural area in Egypt in the 19th century was due to different policies of land tenure. Like a few of women, they had access, to land or to movable assets. That was due to the inheritance law or some norms about, the ownership or the property rights in rural areas. And they had, they didn't participate in social productions apart from slavery, agricultural activities, and they didn't. You need to highlight, their position in family units, whether or not they can make decisions, they can arrange marriage or divorce for themselves, which actually was not the case in rural areas. And the prevailing ideological definition of women's role in the in rural areas that actually considered, women that actually rebelled or against, or they didn't comply with husbands, decisions as unfit mother. So it's kind of interlocking of four main factors that actually would account for the subordinate or submissive position of women in rural areas in Egypt in the 19th century. And like a new trend, they focus on these kind of neoliberal forms of oppression and the entry barrier, that increased entry barrier of women to labor market. And this actually disclosed, some sort of cross-border activism, and they tried, to explore different possibilities to help women to actively engage in activism in order to advance or to improve their socioeconomic status. Islamic modernism and Muslim feminism. Any guess on this? How like Muslim feminists would argue for or against women's rights? Yeah. So there are like, different trends. So some of them, they interjected, some sort of modern concepts in order to highlight the role of the citizenship rights, how to get women, actively engaged, in decision making, in political participation, and in like occupying, some high level official positions in order to make, decisions at the national level. And others, they offered some sort of reinterpretation or rereading of the scriptures in order to highlight the critical overview from within. So some of them they highlighted, the agency of women within Islamic traditions by reinterpreting, these kind of scriptures, Quran and Prophet Muhammad teachings. And some others, they provided this anti-patriarchal reading of the text, and some of them rejected, the notion of hijab, and others, they accepted this as appropriation of forms of religiosity, rather than endorsement or internalization of these patriarchal or subjugation. It's not like relationship between, like, it's not in relationship to man. It's kind of how they have control over their own body. And others, they highlight, this egalitarian principles, how they reconstruct, these kind of values in relation to gender, like how, like rather than using, woman body as a medium to produce different kind of discourse, it's kind of a substance or a necessary means in order to empower women politically, socially, and economically. And others, actually, they offered, this kind of indigenous resistance against Western agenda. So they offered, they had this kind of reactionary approach in order to reject, this radical sexuality, and highlighted what hijab or veil meaning to them: modesty, resistance, or portable seclusion, or privacy. It depends, like different meanings, women would assign to wearing headscarf. Like another, like, studies or another trend, they focus on, they offer more complex understanding of women issues in the Middle East by offering, this kind of, by bringing the state back into the analysis and highlighting the agency of women in order to repudiate or to reject, some predominant explanations of gender role, or taking part in processes of a state building, or playing important role in associational spaces. So due to this kind of, away from these kind of Western culture or Western values or Enlightenment missions, so they highlight, the complex factors and processes that affected, the representation of women. First of all, they highlight the woman representation in states, discourse, and institutions, how the state, using some sort of linguistic articulations, affected women representation, and what kind of institutions affected, the status of women, or empowering or disempowering women. And construction of women agencies, the agency of women in war and peace times, and then, like, they contextualize diversity in Islam as as a cultural norm, or because I don't know how, to what extent they use like Islam as a religion, or like from theological viewpoint, or from like cultural norms, and they reduce it, to the hijab issue, or the headscarf only. So they pushed, they nudged the needle away, from this kind of Islam and populism, in order to highlight, the interaction between state institutions and agency of women, or different contexts that shaped, the world of Muslim women. Starting out with the state discourse and the institutional representation of gender. So first of all, women were used as symbols of nation. In Egypt, for example, in the anti-colonial struggle, in order to craft, collective national image, this kind of frequent metaphor of the nation as a woman had been circulated in order to instill, or to create, or to craft this public or collective imagery about the nation. So using, these kind of different images, highlighting, if they need, to highlight, this roots in old civilizations or in pharaohs, they use, some figures from this period in order to highlight, the affinity of the Egyptian civilization to this, rather than the Ottoman Empire, for example. Or in order to highlight, this kind of agricultural or peasantry nature. So they use, again, women in order to instill, or to create, or to construct this image. It depends on how, the state would use, would target, or would aim at. So they use women in order to create, this vision of national identity. And as I mentioned, nations nation had been depicted as a woman, or as a female, in order to introduce, or to ignite, this kind of sentiments against occupiers, or against colonial power. So they depicted, the state or the nation as a woman, and for a man, in order to defend the honor of the nation, or to develop this grace, against colonizers. So they create this gendered image of the nation, and they create this family honor. This is it's a big issue, in the Middle East, and they use, this ard, or honor, as a metaphor, in order to create, these kind of anti-sentiments towards the occupier as a raper of the nation, and males, had to revolt in order to defend the honor of the gendered image of this of the nation as a woman. So this created this collective image or memory of morality, in order to ignite, feelings against colonizers that were depicted as rapers, that they raped the nation, and the anti-colonial struggle had to be geared towards, the saving or defending the honor of the nation. And of course, of this gendered image, or any take on this, how this gendered image affected, the representation of women in popular culture. Yeah.
I think it must have been the other way around, right? The idea of already having women as an honorary role, even in the family, and then being scaled up to the national level. So I guess even in a micro level, within the family, or within the smaller community, it was such that women held family honor.
Yeah, but for them, the state used this discourse that had this kind of sexual connotation. So this kind of using female sexuality in order to trigger, feelings against, or to instill certain collective image about the nation. This actually enhanced this patriarchal or masculinity, rather than helping, women to represent themselves. So they use them in this kind of linguistic articulation in order to achieve. They instrumentalize this in order to achieve some particular outcomes. So this actually, as I mentioned, reinforced, these cultural ideas of masculinity. And in another trend, they use again woman body as the figuratively, the anchor, the future of the economic future of the nation in women's body as well. So they used women in order to introduce or to disseminate, this to sell policies of family planning and birth control. So this kind of, it becomes like, it has like increasingly become like women's individual responsibility in order to assure the well-being of the country and the future of the country economically and socially. And in some countries, and specifically in Palestine, they use like woman body and reproduction as a form of resistance, as a manifestation of cultural authenticity against colonizers, because like the Zionist discourse like depicted Palestinians as productively backward and primitive, and the Zionists are productively like modern. So that's why it triggered feelings in rural areas, that they used like this conception of Izwa or clan power, that they have like so many like children, and it's a manifestation of this Izwa or clan power in order to resist or to push back against the discourse as a form of resistance and pushing back against the Zionist discourse. So it's patriotic duty for them to have like more children and to develop as part and parcel of the nationalist discourse. And this actually, by the way, triggered divisions inside Palestinians themselves along rural and urban divide, because like some urban areas, they endorsed the same discourse, and they considered this kind of Izwa as a form of like pre-modern element or pre-modern factor. So here, like reproductive politics became a site of negotiation and contestation in order to have like this debate about modernity and traditions as a form of resistance against colonizers. This is but a footnote, it triggered divisions inside Palestinians or Palestinian ranks as well. This is as a discourse, like how the state would use institutions or the state institutions affected the representation of women, especially or more specifically with regards to women's legal rights or family law. So the point here, by like the argument put forward by Shard here, in order to understand the position of women with regards to family law or the legal status, so you need to bring back into the analysis the power struggle or the processes of the state building and strategies of alliance building that actually in some countries, as it happened in Morocco and Algeria, the state elites or the post-colonial elites had to strike a deal or alliance with patrilineal kinship networks in order to enable them to govern or to stabilize their position. So in this sense, they have like, to concede to their conservative demands by restricting, the position, the family laws or the position of women in family. So Tunisia diverged, had like different trajectory due to the lack of this kind of powerful of tribes or the tribes' positions in social orders was not that strong or prominent in comparison to Algeria and Morocco. So that's why they advanced, this kind of progressive women's rights with regard to marriage, divorce, and the court mandate and gender equality. So in order to understand this, you need to highlight the interaction between state and social class interactions by analyzing or zooming in on the pre-colonial tribal power, form of colonial rule, and characteristics of a state emerged from the anti-colonial struggles. So it's not necessarily related to religion per se, but like you need to highlight, these kind of complex interactions with regards to the processes of state making and alliance building. And this is one of the criticism offered to the modernization theory by assigning, prominent role to the state as the agent of social change by advancing, the role of modernizing role that would help women their political and social status. Another like alternative conceptualization, like away from the state discourse and institutions, they highlight the agency of women. So when it comes to what agency means, like quickly, how to realize, their own interest, how they self-express, how they express themselves, or how they construct, the world of their own choice. So it might be, as we are going to discuss this in some detail in the seminar, okay? But it doesn't necessarily entail, this subversion of norms, or it's not like a binary choice between subordination or subversion. So perhaps they might like have the will, or they freely choose, to maintain, the status quo, or to endorse, these kind of norms and values. So like by doing, this kind of ethnography and bringing women's narrative and gender specific experiences, so you need to see the world through, the actors, so through women's viewpoint, with this kind of fluidity, or the fluid system of meaning, and bringing the context back into the analysis. And this is what the Kurdish fighters actually did. For example, they offered like criticism to the notion of the pacifist, maternal feminism. So the women in the battlefield are no longer viable objects, that they might be a target, or might be a victim of violence, and male violence, or they rejected, this notion of gender role as well, and they actively engaged in the military operation. They became part and parcel, or essential part of the military operation against ISIS. So they created, this discourse about, new gender role, like the women can take part in military operations, or in fighting against enemies. And they created, the critiqued, the interventionist role of the international organizations, that they depicted them as a target, of male in the battlefield, by advancing, alternative discourse of this heroic, victimhood discourse. In Egypt, for example, they had these kind of different associational or organizational forms, and they became part of the nation building. So they had their own charity and social works and political and human rights, and they constructed or established Egyptian clubs and feminist union, and they had different media outlets, or different that actually triggered or ignited, direct political action. Duria Shafi and Huda Sharawi. Huda Sharawi was actually in Western academia was depicted only by or they attracted, this interest because it took off, the headscarf at the train station. But she had other things. She did other things apart from this, and it depended on the context as well back then. And then contextualizing diversity in Islam, and this is I leave it there, and we will pick it up, we will build on this in the seminar discussions. So there was a shift, from the role of Islam, in subjugation and oppression, and basically contextualizing, this hijab, what hijab meaning. So the key point here, there is no master narrative across time and space. For example, at the same time, Fanon mentioned, unveiling Algeria by the French colonizers, veiling women was an act of resistance for them. At the same time, in Egypt, unveiling women was an act of resistance due to their prevailing cultural norms. And there is it's not necessarily a manifestation of internalization of subjugation due to this kind of false consciousness or internalization of patriarchal norms through socialization. And this is what it's a bit convoluted argument, but it's still interesting, advanced by Saba Mahmoud, and this is what we are going to discuss in the seminar. And in some other contexts, it's not a translation of revivalism of traditions. It's a matter of reappropriation or appropriation of religiosity or a way of life by women, not necessarily a a benchmark against which women would take decisions, but they might take decisions by themselves to represent themselves and to establish and reproduce their own values and traditions. In the seminar, we're going to focus on Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, and we will try to offer more complex understanding of women rights in the region in 3 different contexts. Okay, see you there.